At the will reading in downtown Chicago, my sister Sarah grabbed what she thought was my $45 million inheritance check and set it on fire right there in the lawyer's office. The whole family gasped as the flames consumed what they believed was my future, but I just smiled. Because what Sarah didn't know was that I had switched the real check hours earlier. She had just burned a worthless piece of paper while the actual inheritance sat safely in my purse. What none of them realized was that for the past 2 years I had been quietly preparing for this exact moment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany-paneled conference room at Whitman & Associates smelled of leather-bound books and old money. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the bustling streets of downtown Chicago, where people hurried past in their winter coats, oblivious to the family drama unfolding 43 floors above them. I sat in one of the burgundy leather chairs arranged around the massive oval table, my hands folded in my lap, trying to appear smaller than I already felt. My father Robert had been dead for exactly 1 week. The funeral had been a spectacle of grief and greed disguised as mourning, with distant relatives suddenly appearing to pay their respects to a man they hadn't spoken to in years. Now we were gathered for the reading of his will, the moment everyone had been anticipating since the doctors first mentioned the word terminal. Sarah arrived 20 minutes late, which was typical. She swept into the room like she owned it, her designer heels clicking against the polished hardwood floors. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her black Chanel suit probably cost more than I made in 3 months working at the nonprofit downtown. Behind her followed Thomas, her husband, looking uncomfortable in his expensive suit. He nodded at me briefly before taking his seat beside Sarah. My sister had always been the golden child. Beautiful, ambitious, and ruthless, in ways that our father admired. She graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern, married a successful investment banker, and lived in a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. I, on the other hand, had disappointed our father in every conceivable way. I studied social work instead of business, chose to help homeless families instead of maximizing profits, and remained stubbornly single despite his frequent attempts to set me up with the sons of his business associates. The contrast between us was never more apparent than in that conference room. Sarah commanded attention simply by existing, while I tried to blend into the furniture. She wore confidence like a second skin, while I felt like an imposter in my modest black dress from Target. Even our positioning at the table seemed deliberate. Sarah sat directly across from Marcus Whitman, our father's longtime attorney, while I was relegated to a corner seat near the window. Marcus cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He was a thin man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of measured demeanor that came from decades of handling delicate family situations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He had known our family since before I was born, had watched Sarah and me grow up, had witnessed countless dinner parties where our father would praise Sarah's accomplishments while barely acknowledging my presence. Also present were our cousin Diana, who had flown in from Seattle, and Jennifer, Marcus's assistant, who sat quietly in the corner with her laptop, ready to document everything. Diana caught my eye and offered a small, encouraging smile. She was one of the few family members who had ever treated me with genuine kindness, perhaps because she understood what it felt like to be overlooked by our father. The will itself was a thick document bound in navy blue leather. Marcus opened it with the reverence of someone handling a sacred text. The pages rustled as he found the relevant section, and the sound seemed amplified in the tense silence of the room. He began with the formal language, the legal jargon that established our father's mental competence and the validity of his final wishes. Then came the smaller bequests. Diana would receive $50,000 and our grandmother's jewelry. Thomas would get $25,000, which seemed generous considering he had only married into the family 5 years ago. Various charities would receive donations totaling $2 million, including, surprisingly, the homeless shelter where I worked. I felt a flutter of hope when Marcus mentioned the shelter. Maybe our father had been paying more attention to my work than I thought. Maybe he had finally understood that helping people mattered more than profit margins. But then Marcus continued reading, and my hope deflated like a punctured balloon. The manufacturing company that our father had built from nothing would go to Sarah, along with all its assets, properties, and future profits. The Lake Forest mansion, with its 15 bedrooms and Olympic-sized pool, would also be hers. The art collection, the wine cellar, the vintage car collection, the yacht, the vacation homes in Aspen and Martha's Vineyard. Everything that mattered, everything that represented our father's legacy, would belong to Sarah. Then came my portion. A trust fund worth exactly $45 million, with one condition that made my blood run cold. The money would be released to me only after I married someone our father deemed suitable, as determined by a committee of his business associates. Until that time, I would receive a modest monthly allowance of $3,000, barely enough to cover rent on my tiny Lincoln Park apartment. Sarah's reaction was immediate and explosive. She shot to her feet, her face flushed with anger. "That's it?" she demanded, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "She gets $45 million for doing nothing while I get the responsibility of running a business?" Marcus remained calm, his hands folded over the will. "Your sister's inheritance comes with significant restrictions, Sarah. The company and properties you're inheriting are worth considerably more than $45 million. But Sarah wasn't listening to reason. She had always been competitive, even as children. When I got a good grade, she had to get a better one. When I made a friend, she had to steal them away. The idea that I might receive anything she perceived as valuable was intolerable to her." "This is ridiculous," she continued, pacing behind her chair like a caged animal. "Erica has never shown any interest in the family business. She's wasted her life working with homeless people and bleeding hearts. She doesn't deserve Dad's money." I wanted to defend myself, to point out that helping people wasn't a waste, that my work at the shelter had meaning beyond profit margins. But I had learned long ago that arguing with Sarah was futile. She had inherited our father's ability to twist any conversation to her advantage. Thomas placed a gentle hand on Sarah's arm, trying to calm her down. "Honey, maybe we should discuss this privately." She shook him off. "No, this needs to be addressed now." "Marcus, surely there's some way to contest this. Dad wasn't thinking clearly in his final months. The cancer medications, the pain pills, they affected his judgment." Marcus's expression hardened slightly. "Your father was completely lucid when he signed this will, Sarah. I have medical documentation to that effect. The will is ironclad." Diana shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had always tried to stay out of family conflicts, but even she seemed disturbed by Sarah's naked greed. "Maybe we should focus on honoring your father's memory instead of fighting over money," she suggested quietly. Sarah turned on her with fury. "Easy for you to say. You're walking away with $50,000 and some jewelry. You don't have to worry about running a company or maintaining properties or dealing with the tax implications of inheriting a business." The argument continued for another 20 minutes, with Sarah alternating between threats to contest the will and attempts to manipulate Marcus into finding loopholes. Throughout it all, I sat quietly, processing the reality of my situation. $45 million, but only if I married someone my deceased father approved of. It was his final attempt to control my life, to force me into the kind of conventional existence he had always wanted for me. Finally, Marcus ended the discussion by producing the actual checks. He had already prepared them, anticipating that the family would want immediate access to the liquid portions of their inheritance. Diana's $50,000 check was modest and unremarkable. But mine was different. It was drawn on the estate's primary account, printed on thick, cream-colored paper with elegant script. $45 million and 0 cents, made out to Erica Marie Patterson. I stared at the check, barely believing the number of zeros. It represented more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. Enough to fund my shelter for decades. Enough to make a real difference in the world. But it also represented my father's final manipulation, his last attempt to force me into a life I didn't want. Sarah leaned across the table, trying to get a better look at the check. Her eyes widened when she saw the amount, and her face darkened with renewed anger. "This is insane," she muttered. "Absolutely insane." Marcus gathered his papers and stood up, clearly eager to end the meeting. "If there are no further questions, I think we can conclude today's proceedings." Sarah, I'll have the business transfer documents ready for your signature next week. Erica, the trust fund paperwork will take a bit longer to process, but your monthly allowances will begin immediately. As everyone prepared to leave, Sarah suddenly reached across the table and grabbed my check. The movement was so quick and unexpected that no one had time to react. She held it up, examining it closely, her face twisted with rage and jealousy. "You know what, Erica?" she said, her voice deadly quiet. "You don't deserve this money. You've never contributed anything to this family. You've embarrassed Dad with your career choices, your lifestyle, your complete lack of ambition. This money should go to someone who actually understands its value." Before anyone could stop her, she pulled out her cigarette lighter. The flame danced in the dim light of the conference room as she held it beneath the check. "If you can't appreciate what you've been given, then maybe you don't deserve to have it at all." The paper caught fire immediately, curling at the edges as the flames consumed the elegant script. $45 million turned to ash in a matter of seconds, floating down to the polished conference table like snow. Thomas gasped. Diana covered her mouth in shock. Marcus started to protest, but it was too late. Through it all, I just smiled. Everyone stared at me in confusion. They expected tears, anger, devastation. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out an identical check, same amount, same account, same elegant script. I placed it gently on the table where everyone could see it. "Thank you for that demonstration, Sarah," I said quietly. "You've just proved exactly why Dad made the right decision about who deserves what." The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah's face went through several shades of red and white as she realized what had happened. Marcus looked confused but intrigued. Diana started to smile. Thomas stared at both checks, trying to understand how there could be two identical documents. Sarah's voice came out as a strangled whisper. "How did you—" I stood up slowly, smoothing down my modest black dress. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had the upper hand with my sister. I called Marcus yesterday and asked for a copy of the check for my records. Standard procedure, really. I had a feeling today might get dramatic. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The check Miss Patterson is holding is the original. The one that was just destroyed was indeed a copy." Sarah sank into her chair, the lighter still clutched in her trembling hand. She had just revealed her true nature in front of witnesses, had shown everyone exactly how far she was willing to go to deny me what our father had left me. The golden child had finally shown her tarnish. I picked up my purse and walked toward the door, pausing only to look back at my sister. "You know, Sarah, Dad always said that character is revealed in crisis. I think he would have been very interested in what we all witnessed here today." As I left the conference room, I heard Diana following behind me. In the hallway, she caught up and placed a gentle hand on my arm. "That was brilliant," she whispered. "How did you know she would do something like that?" I thought about the question as we waited for the elevator. How had I known? Perhaps it was 28 years of watching Sarah's reactions whenever she felt threatened or overlooked. Perhaps it was the way she had looked at the check, the calculation in her eyes. Or perhaps it was simply the understanding that some people reveal their true nature when they think no one is watching. I didn't know for certain, I admitted as the elevator doors opened. But I hoped that if she showed everyone who she really is, they might finally understand why Dad made the choices he did. As we descended toward the lobby, I reflected on what had just happened. The check in my purse represented freedom, but also responsibility. $45 million was more than personal wealth. It was an opportunity to make real change in the world, to help people who had been forgotten by society, to prove that money could be used for something more than personal gratification. But first, I had to figure out how to access that money without compromising my principles. The marriage requirement was still there, still binding, still my father's final attempt to control my choices. The battle with Sarah was won, but the war for my independence was just beginning. The elevator reached the ground floor, and Diana and I stepped out into the marble lobby of the law firm. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see Chicago spread out before us, millions of people living their lives, unaware that a small drama had just played out 43 floors above them. Some of those people were struggling, homeless, forgotten, My father's money could help them, but only if I could find a way around his conditions. As we walked toward the street, I made a decision. I would not let my father control my life from the grave, and I would not let Sarah's greed and jealousy define our family's legacy. The money would be mine, on my terms, and I would use it to prove that kindness and compassion were worth more than profit margins and social status. The war was far from over, but today's victory felt like a promising beginning. Sarah had revealed herself, and I had shown that I was not the weak, naive woman everyone believed me to be. The real battle for my inheritance was about to begin, and for the first time in my life, I felt ready to fight. The next morning came too early, jarring me awake with the harsh buzz of my alarm clock at 6:30. I had barely slept, my mind replaying the events in Marcus's office over and over again. The image of Sarah's face when she realized what she had done kept flashing through my thoughts, along with the satisfied weight of the real check still sitting in my purse on the nightstand. My Lincoln Park apartment was a far cry from Sarah's Gold Coast penthouse. The radiator clanged and hissed as it struggled to heat the small space, and I could hear my upstairs neighbor's footsteps echoing through the thin ceiling. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person, with a refrigerator that hummed too loudly and cabinets that stuck when you tried to open them. But it was mine, paid for with money I had earned helping people, and that meant something to me. I made coffee in my ancient coffee maker and sat at the small table by the window, watching the early commuters hurry past on the sidewalk below. Chicago in January was brutal, with a wind that cut through even the heaviest coats and sidewalks treacherous with ice. I watched a woman slip slightly as she navigated around a patch of black ice, catching herself just in time. It reminded me of how I felt most days, constantly trying to keep my balance in a world that seemed designed to trip me up. My phone had been buzzing incessantly since 7 o'clock. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails. I finally worked up the courage to check them while sipping my coffee. The first was from Diana, sent at 11:47 the night before. "Erica, I can't stop thinking about what happened today. Are you okay? Please call me when you get this." The next few were from numbers I didn't recognize, probably reporters who had somehow gotten wind of the story. The Chicago business community was surprisingly small, and news of Robert Patterson's will reading was bound to spread quickly, especially when it involved a dramatic scene like Sarah burning a $45 million check. But it was the voicemail from Sarah that made my stomach clench. Her voice was different from the rage I had witnessed yesterday, lower and more controlled, which somehow made it more threatening. "Erica, we need to talk. What you did yesterday was manipulative and calculated, and it's not going to stand. Call me back by noon or I'll come to your apartment. And trust me, you don't want me showing up there." I set the phone down and tried to steady my breathing. Sarah had always been intimidating, but there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't finished with yesterday's humiliation. She had always been someone who needed to win, who couldn't tolerate being outsmarted or embarrassed. The fact that I had anticipated her behavior and prepared for it would eat at her like acid. The second voicemail was from Thomas, Sarah's husband. His voice was apologetic and uncomfortable. "Hi, Erica, it's Thomas. I just wanted to say that what Sarah did yesterday was completely out of line. I've never seen her act like that before, and I'm honestly shocked. I hope we can move past this as a family. Maybe we could all sit down and talk things through calmly." Poor Thomas. He was a decent man who had married into our family without fully understanding what he was getting into. He saw Sarah's ambition and drive, but I don't think he had ever witnessed her capacity for cruelty when she felt threatened. Yesterday had probably been an eye-opening experience for him. By 9 o'clock, I was dressed and ready to face whatever the day would bring. I had chosen my outfit carefully, a navy blue blazer over dark jeans and boots that could handle the icy sidewalks. Professional but not overdressed, confident but not arrogant. I had learned that clothing could be armor, especially when dealing with people who judged you based on appearances. The homeless shelter where I worked was a 20-minute walk from my apartment, located in a converted warehouse on the west side of the city. Hope Haven served about 200 people on any given night, providing not just beds and meals, but also job training, mental health services, and help navigating the complex bureaucracy of social services. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary work, and it gave me a sense of purpose that I had never found in the corporate world my father had wanted me to join. As I walked through the front doors, I was greeted by the familiar sounds of breakfast service. Volunteers moved efficiently between long tables, serving coffee and scrambled eggs to clients who ranged from elderly men who had lost their homes, to medical bankruptcy, to young mothers trying to get back on their feet after domestic violence. The air smelled of industrial coffee and disinfectant, with underlying notes of unwashed clothing and desperation that no amount of cleaning could completely eliminate. Maria Santos, the shelter director, looked up from the clipboard she was studying and waved me over. She was a small woman in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering. She had been running Hope Haven for 15 years, somehow managing to keep the place operating despite chronic underfunding and constant bureaucratic obstacles. "Erica, thank God you're here. I heard about your father, and I wasn't sure if you'd be coming in this week." I hung my coat on the rack behind her desk and accepted the cup of coffee she offered me. I needed to be here. This place keeps me grounded. Maria studied my face with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years reading people's emotional states. "You look like you didn't sleep much. Are you handling everything okay?" I almost laughed at the question. How could I explain that I had just inherited $45 million with strings attached, that my sister had tried to burn my inheritance check, that I was now facing threats and manipulations from family members who had never shown any interest in my well-being? Instead, I just nodded and changed the subject. "What do we have going on today?" Maria launched into the daily briefing. We had 3 new admissions overnight, including a veteran with PTSD who was having trouble adjusting to shelter life. The city health inspector was coming by at 2 o'clock for our monthly review. The heating system in the women's dormitory was acting up again, and the repair estimate was more than our monthly maintenance budget. As she talked, I found myself thinking about the money sitting in my purse. $45 million could solve every problem Hope Haven faced. We could renovate the entire building, hire more staff, expand our programs, maybe even purchase additional properties to serve more clients. But the marriage requirement stood between me and that money like a locked door with no key. My father had known exactly what he was doing when he structured the inheritance that way. He had never approved of my work at the shelter, seeing it as a phase one would eventually outgrow. He believed that marriage to the right man would redirect my energies toward more appropriate pursuits, like charity galas and hospital board meetings. The kind of genteel do-gooding that made wealthy people feel better about themselves without actually challenging the systems that created inequality in the first place. The morning passed quickly as I threw myself into the familiar routines of shelter work. I helped serve breakfast, assisted 2 clients with job applications, and spent an hour on the phone with a caseworker trying to get housing assistance for a family of 4. The work was demanding and sometimes heartbreaking, but it reminded me why I had chosen this path despite my father's disapproval. At 11:30, my phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and my stomach immediately tightened. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but I knew she would just keep calling until I answered. "Hello, Sarah. Don't you? Hello, Sarah me." Her voice was sharp and angry, any pretense of sisterly civility completely abandoned. "We're meeting for lunch today. 12:30 at the Peninsula Hotel. Don't even think about not showing up." The Peninsula was Sarah's choice, of course. It was expensive, exclusive, and designed to make people like me feel out of place. The kind of restaurant where lunch cost more than most of my clients made in a week. "I'm working, Sarah. I can't just drop everything because you want to have lunch." "Yes, you can, and you will. Because if you don't, I'm going to make your life very difficult." Yesterday's little stunt might have impressed Marcus and Diana, but it doesn't change anything. That money should be mine, and we both know it. I closed my eyes and counted to 5 before responding. "The will is legally binding, Sarah. Dad made his decision. Dad made a mistake. He was sick, medicated, not thinking clearly. But mistakes can be corrected." Her voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more menacing than her earlier shouting. 12:30, Erica. Don't make me come find you." The line went dead, and I stared at my phone for a long moment. Maria appeared beside me, concern written across her face. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Family drama. I need to step out for lunch, but I'll be back by 2. The walk to the Peninsula Hotel took me through some of Chicago's most affluent neighborhoods. The contrast was jarring after spending the morning at the shelter. Here the sidewalks were perfectly clear of ice and snow. The storefronts displayed luxury goods with price tags that could feed a family for months. Well-dressed people moved with the confident stride of those who had never worried about where their next meal would come from. The hotel lobby was a study in understated elegance. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the kind of hush that money could buy. I felt underdressed despite my careful outfit choice, but I held my head high as I approached the hostess at the restaurant entrance. "I'm meeting Sarah Patterson," I told her. The hostess smiled with practiced warmth. "Of course, Ms. Patterson is already seated. Right this way." She led me through the dining room, past tables where business deals were being negotiated over $50 steaks and $100 bottles of wine. Sarah had chosen a corner table with a view of the city, positioning herself with her back to the wall so she could see the entire room. It was a power move, subtle but deliberate. She looked magnificent, as always. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her black cashmere dress probably cost more than I made in 3 months. She was studying her phone when I approached, not bothering to look up until I was standing directly beside the table. "You're late," she said without preamble. "I'm 2 minutes late. Traffic was heavier than expected." She gestured to the chair across from her, and I sat down, placing my purse carefully beside my feet. The waiter appeared immediately, as if summoned by some invisible signal. "The lady will have a water," Sarah told him before I could speak. "I'll have another martini." It was another power play, ordering for me like I was a child who couldn't make her own decisions. I waited until the waiter left before speaking. "What do you want, Sarah?" She leaned back in her chair, studying me with the cold calculation of a predator sizing up its prey. "I want you to renounce your inheritance." I almost laughed. "Why would I do that?" "Because you don't deserve it. Because you've never contributed anything meaningful to this family or to society. Because that money could actually do some good in the hands of someone who understands business and investment." The waiter returned with our drinks, and I took a sip of water before responding. "Dad left me that money, Sarah. If he wanted you to have it, he would have given it to you." Her face flushed with anger. Dad was manipulated. He was sick, confused, probably influenced by those social workers and bleeding hearts you surround yourself with. They convinced him that your little charity work was meaningful, when really you're just enabling people who refuse to take responsibility for their own lives. The casual cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. This was what Sarah really thought of my work, of the people I tried to help, of everything I had chosen to do with my life. To her, helping others was weakness, compassion was manipulation, and anyone who struggled was simply lazy or incompetent. "You know what I think?" she continued, leaning forward across the table. "I think you orchestrated this whole thing. I think you spent months working on Dad, filling his head with guilt about how he treated you, making him think he owed you something. You played the victim card perfectly, didn't you?" I set my water glass down carefully, trying to keep my hands from shaking. "You think I wanted Dad to die? You think I enjoyed watching him suffer through cancer treatments? You think any amount of money is worth losing a parent? I think you saw an opportunity and you took it. And that little performance yesterday with the fake check? That wasn't spontaneous. You planned that, didn't you? You knew I would react emotionally, and you set me up to look bad in front of Marcus and Diana." She wasn't wrong about that part. I had anticipated her reaction and prepared for it. But hearing her describe it as a calculated manipulation made me feel sick. Had I really stooped to her level? Had I become as scheming and manipulative as the woman sitting across from me? "The check you burned was a copy," I said quietly. "That's all. But you knew I would try to destroy it. You knew I was angry and frustrated, and you used that against me." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. See? You're more like me than you want to admit. The only difference is that I'm honest about what I am. The waiter returned to take our order, but Sarah waved him away. This wasn't about lunch. This was about intimidation, about trying to break me down until I agreed to give up what Dad had left me. Here's what's going to happen, Sarah continued. You're going to go back to Marcus and tell him you've decided to renounce your inheritance. You'll say that you realize Dad wasn't thinking clearly when he made the will, that you don't feel right taking money that should go to family members who actually understand its value. And if I don't? Her smile widened. Then I'll contest the will. I'll drag this through probate court for years. I'll hire the best lawyers money can buy, and I'll make your life a living hell. Do you have any idea how expensive it is to fight a will contest? How long it takes? How much dirty laundry gets aired in public? I thought about the shelter, about Maria and the clients who depended on our services. I thought about the heating system that needed repair and the programs we couldn't afford to expand. $45 million could change so many lives, but only if I could access it. You're forgetting something, I said. I can't renounce an inheritance I can't access. The money is tied up in a trust until I get married. Then get married. Find some desperate man who's willing to marry you for a cut of the money. It shouldn't be too hard, even for someone like you. The contempt in her voice was breathtaking. This was my sister, someone who had shared a childhood with me, who had grown up in the same house with the same parents. And she was talking about me like I was something she had scraped off her shoe. Someone like me? I repeated. Come on, Erica. You're 28 years old, you work at a homeless shelter, you live in a tiny apartment, and you dress like a social worker from 1995. You're not exactly a catch. But $45 million makes anyone attractive. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the marble floor. Several other diners looked over curiously, drawn by the sound. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she realized I was leaving. Sit down. We're not finished here. Yes, we are. I picked up my purse and looked down at her. You want to contest the will? Go ahead. Hire your expensive lawyers. Drag this through court. But you should know something first. She raised an eyebrow, waiting. I recorded our conversation yesterday at Marcus's office. The whole thing. Your threats. Your tantrum. Your attempt to destroy my inheritance check. I also recorded this conversation. I tapped my phone, which I had placed on the table when I sat down. So if you want to go to court and claim that Dad wasn't thinking clearly when he made his will, you'll have to explain to a judge why you think burning someone else's inheritance check was the rational response of someone who deserves to inherit a business empire. The color drained from Sarah's face. She stared at my phone like it was a snake that might strike at any moment. You wouldn't dare. Try me. I turned to leave, then paused and looked back. Oh, and Sarah? Lunch is on you. I'm sure you can afford it. I walked out of the Peninsula Hotel with my head held high, but by the time I reached the sidewalk, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I had just declared war on my own sister, someone with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. The recording was real, but would it be enough to protect me from whatever she planned to do next? The walk back to the shelter gave me time to think. Sarah was right about one thing. I had planned yesterday's scene with the fake check. I had anticipated her reaction and prepared for it. Did that make me manipulative? Maybe, but it also made me smart, and for the first time in my life, I had used that intelligence to protect myself, instead of just trying to keep the peace. The heating in the women's dormitory was still broken when I returned to Hope Haven. I spent the rest of the afternoon helping Maria coordinate with repair technicians and trying to figure out how to pay for the necessary work. As I watched our clients bundled in extra blankets and coats, trying to stay warm in a building that should have been their refuge, I thought about the money sitting in my purse and the obstacles standing between me and the ability to use it to help people. Sarah was right about something else, too. I needed to get married to access the inheritance, but not to some desperate man who would marry me for money. I needed to find another way, a solution that would satisfy the legal requirements of the will without compromising my principles or my independence. As the day wound down and the evening shift took over, I sat in Maria's office and stared out the window at the city lights, beginning to twinkle in the darkness. Somewhere out there, Sarah was probably plotting her next move. Thomas was likely trying to talk sense into his wife. Diana was probably worried about what our family drama would do to Dad's memory. And I was sitting in a homeless shelter, surrounded by people who needed help, holding the key to millions of dollars that could change lives but locked behind a condition designed to control me from beyond the grave. The war with Sarah was just beginning, but I had won the first battle. The question now was whether I was strong enough to win the war, and smart enough to find a way to access Dad's money without sacrificing everything I believed in. The inheritance was mine by right, but claiming it would require a strategy more complex than anything I had ever attempted. I pulled out my phone and stared at the recording of today's lunch conversation. Sarah had revealed her true nature, her willingness to destroy me to get what she wanted. But she had also revealed something else. She was scared. Scared that I might actually be smarter than she had given me credit for. Scared that for once in our lives I might actually win. That fear was going to be her downfall. And I was going to make sure of it. 3 years earlier, I had been standing in a very different place, wearing a very different life. The corporate offices of Patterson Manufacturing occupied 2 floors of a gleaming tower in Chicago's Loop, all glass and steel, and the kind of aggressive modernity that my father believed projected success. I was 25 then, fresh out of Northwestern with a degree in business administration that I had earned to please him, working as a junior analyst in the company's strategic planning department. My cubicle was located in the middle of a sea of identical workspaces, each occupied by ambitious young professionals who saw Patterson Manufacturing as a stepping stone to bigger and better things. They wore expensive suits, carried the latest phones, and spoke in the corporate jargon that my father admired. Return on investment, synergistic opportunities, paradigm shifts. I had learned the language, but it felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking words in a dialect I had never quite mastered. The work itself was mind-numbing. I spent my days analyzing market trends, creating PowerPoint presentations that would be forgotten within hours, and attending meetings where nothing of substance was ever decided. My father had insisted that I start at the bottom, that I earn my place in the company through merit rather than nepotism. It was a noble sentiment, but the reality was that everyone knew exactly who I was, and they treated me with the careful deference reserved for the boss's daughter. Sarah, meanwhile, had been fast-tracked through the management program and was already an assistant vice president at 26. She thrived in the corporate environment, navigating office politics with the same ruthless efficiency she had displayed as a child. She knew exactly which meetings to attend, which projects to champion, and which colleagues to cultivate. Our father beamed with pride whenever he talked about her accomplishments. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday in November. I was working late, trying to finish a market analysis report that was due the next morning, when I received an email from the Human Resources Department. Patterson Manufacturing was implementing cost-cutting measures due to a temporary downturn in orders. 53 employees would be laid off, effective immediately. Their names were listed in alphabetical order, each one representing a family that would struggle to pay rent, to buy groceries, to maintain health insurance. I recognized many of the names. Janet Morrison, who worked in accounts receivable and had 3 young children. David Chen, a machine operator who had been with the company for 12 years. Rebecca Torres, a quality control inspector who was supporting her elderly mother. These weren't numbers on a spreadsheet. They were real people with real lives, and they were being discarded because the quarterly profits weren't quite high enough to satisfy shareholders. What made it worse was that the layoffs were completely unnecessary. I had access to the financial reports, and I knew that Patterson Manufacturing was still profitable. The company could have easily absorbed the temporary reduction in orders without cutting jobs. But my father and the board of directors had decided that maintaining profit margins was more important than maintaining employment. I printed out the email and walked to my father's corner office, past his assistant who tried to stop me, and through the mahogany doors that separated him from the worker bees in the cubicles. He looked up from his computer with surprise and mild annoyance. "Erica, you should have made an appointment. I'm preparing for tomorrow's board meeting." "I need to talk to you about the layoffs," I said, placing the printed email on his desk. He glanced at it briefly. "What about them?" "It's unfortunate, but necessary. Business sometimes requires difficult decisions. These layoffs aren't necessary, Dad. We're still profitable. We could keep these people employed and still maintain healthy margins." His expression hardened. "Erica, you're looking at the situation through rose-colored glasses. This is business, not charity. Our responsibility is to our shareholders, not to employees who may or may not be essential to our operations. These people have families. They have mortgages, car payments, medical bills. Some of them have been with the company for over a decade. And they'll find other jobs. The economy is strong. Unemployment is low. This isn't a death sentence for any of them." I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man sitting behind the desk with the father who had read me bedtime stories and taught me to ride a bicycle. When had he become so callous? When had profit become more important than people? What if we reduced executive bonuses instead? What if we cut back on some of the perks and unnecessary expenses? There has to be another way. He leaned back in his leather chair, studying me with disappointment. "Erica, I had hoped that working here would teach you how business really operates. But you're still thinking like an idealistic college student. The real world doesn't work the way you want it to. The real world is what we make it, Dad. We have a choice about how we treat people. We have a responsibility to maximize shareholder value. That's not optional. It's a legal obligation." I wanted to argue with him about corporate social responsibility, about the long-term value of loyal employees, about the moral implications of treating people as disposable resources. But I could see in his eyes that he had already made up his mind. The conversation was over. I returned to my cubicle and sat staring at my computer screen for a long time. Around me, my colleagues continued working, oblivious to the fact that 53 of their fellow employees would be cleaning out their desks the next morning. The corporate machine would continue humming along, slightly more efficient and profitable than before. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Janet Morrison and her 3 children, about David Chen and his 12 years of loyal service, about Rebecca Torres and her elderly mother. I thought about the executive bonuses that could have covered their salaries, about the expensive corporate retreats and lavish office renovations that consumed money that could have kept families employed. The next morning, I watched as security guards escorted the laid-off employees from the building. They carried cardboard boxes containing their personal belongings, their faces stunned and hurt. Some of them had tears in their eyes, others looked angry. All of them looked lost. I couldn't concentrate on work that day. Every report I tried to read seemed meaningless. Every meeting felt like a waste of time. During lunch, I walked to a nearby park and sat on a bench, watching office workers hurry past with their takeout containers and urgent phone conversations. These people had jobs, had security, had the luxury of worrying about quarterly reports instead of monthly rent payments. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my entire life. I opened my laptop and began researching local nonprofit organizations. I wasn't sure exactly what I was looking for, but I knew I needed to find work that felt meaningful, that helped people instead of treating them as expendable resources. Hope Haven appeared in my search results almost by accident. Their website was simple and understated, lacking the slick marketing materials that most nonprofits use to attract donors. But their mission statement resonated with me, providing dignity, safety, and opportunity to our most vulnerable neighbors. They weren't trying to save the world with grand gestures. They were focused on meeting basic human needs with compassion and respect. I called their main number and asked to speak with someone about volunteer opportunities. The woman who answered the phone sounded harried but friendly. She explained that they always needed help with meal service, client intake, and administrative tasks. She invited me to come in that weekend to see if it might be a good fit. Hope Haven was located in a converted warehouse on the west side of the city, far from the gleaming towers of the Loop. The building was old and utilitarian, with exposed brick walls and industrial lighting. but it felt alive in a way that Patterson Manufacturing never had. People were constantly moving through the space, volunteers and staff members working together to serve meals, conduct intake interviews, and provide basic services to clients who had nowhere else to turn. Maria Santos met me at the front desk and gave me a tour of the facility. She explained how they operated on a shoestring budget, relying heavily on volunteers and donations to keep their programs running. She showed me the dormitories where clients slept, the cafeteria where they served 3 meals a day, and the computer lab where people could search for jobs and fill out applications for government assistance. What struck me most was the atmosphere. Despite the obvious poverty and desperation of many clients, there was a sense of community and mutual respect that I had never experienced in the corporate world. Staff members knew clients by name, asked about their families, celebrated small victories like finding temporary work or getting approved for housing assistance. I started volunteering every Saturday, helping with breakfast service and spending time talking with clients about their needs and challenges. Many of them had stories that would have been heartbreaking if they weren't so common. Job losses due to company downsizing, medical bankruptcies from unexpected illnesses, evictions caused by rent increases they couldn't afford, family breakups triggered by financial stress. These weren't the lazy, irresponsible people that politicians and pundits liked to blame for their own circumstances. They were working people who had been knocked down by forces beyond their control. Single mothers trying to support children on minimum wage jobs. Veterans struggling with PTSD and unemployment. Elderly people whose fixed incomes couldn't keep pace with rising costs. After 3 months of volunteering, Maria approached me about a part-time paid position. The shelter had received a small grant to hire an additional caseworker, and she thought I might be interested. The salary was less than I spent on coffee in a month at Patterson Manufacturing, but the work would involve helping clients navigate the complex bureaucracy of social services and connecting them with resources that could help them get back on their feet. I accepted immediately, without even thinking about how I would explain it to my father. That conversation came 2 weeks later, when I submitted my resignation to Patterson Manufacturing. I had prepared a careful explanation about wanting to explore different career paths and gain experience in the nonprofit sector. I thought I could frame it as a temporary detour that would ultimately make me a more well-rounded business leader. My father's reaction was explosive. He called me into his office on a Friday afternoon and closed the door with more force than necessary. His face was red with anger and embarrassment. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Erica? You're throwing away everything I've worked to build for you." "I'm not throwing anything away, Dad. I'm trying to find work that feels meaningful to me." "Meaningful? You want to throw away a career in business to work with homeless people? Do you have any idea how that reflects on this company? On this family? It reflects that we care about more than just profit margins. It reflects that my daughter is naive and irresponsible. It reflects that I've failed to teach you anything about the real world." The argument continued for an hour, with my father alternating between anger and disappointment. He couldn't understand why I would want to leave a stable, well-paying job to work for what he called professional do-gooders who accomplish nothing except making themselves feel superior. I tried to explain that the work felt important to me, that I was helping people who had nowhere else to turn, that there was value in providing basic human services to those who needed them most. But he saw it as a rejection of everything he had worked to achieve, a slap in the face to the empire he had built and wanted to pass down to his children. "You're making a mistake, Erica, a big one. And when you come crawling back in 6 months, begging for your job back, don't expect me to welcome you with open arms." "I won't be coming back, Dad. We'll see about that." That conversation marked the beginning of a 3-year period during which my relationship with my father grew increasingly strained. He never explicitly disowned me, but he made it clear that my career choice was a source of disappointment and embarrassment. Family dinners became uncomfortable affairs where he would ask pointed questions about my salary and living situation, comparing my modest income unfavorably to Sarah's rapidly ascending corporate trajectory. Sarah herself seemed genuinely puzzled by my decision, She couldn't understand why anyone would voluntarily choose a life of financial struggle when comfortable alternatives were available. She saw my work at the shelter as a phase, something I would eventually outgrow when I came to my senses and realized that helping people was less important than helping myself. The work itself was harder than I had anticipated. Not just physically, though 12-hour shifts serving meals and conducting intake interviews were exhausting. But emotionally, it was draining to see the same problems recurring over and over again. Clients would find temporary housing only to be evicted again when rent prices increased. They would get jobs only to lose them when transportation problems or childcare issues interfered with their schedules. The social safety net was full of holes, and people fell through them constantly. But there were victories too. Small ones, mostly, but they felt more meaningful than any corporate achievement I had ever experienced. Helping a veteran get approved for disability benefits that he had been fighting for years to receive. Connecting a single mother with childcare assistance that allowed her to accept a full-time job. Watching a client who had been struggling with addiction celebrate 6 months of sobriety. These victories weren't measured in quarterly profit reports or stock prices. They were measured in individual lives that were slightly better, slightly more stable, slightly more hopeful than they had been before. It was slow work, unglamorous work, but it felt real in a way that corporate strategizing never had. My father's cancer diagnosis came during my second year at Hope Haven. The news hit our family like a lightning bolt, sudden and devastating. He had always been so healthy, so vigorous, so convinced of his own invincibility. The idea that his body could betray him seemed impossible. I took time off from the shelter to help with his medical appointments and treatments. We spent long hours in oncology waiting rooms, making awkward conversation about everything except the obvious fact that he was dying. He was still disappointed in my career choices, but the cancer seemed to soften his anger somewhat. He began asking more thoughtful questions about my work, showing genuine curiosity about the clients I served and the challenges they faced. During one of our medical visits, he surprised me by asking if I was happy. We were sitting in a sterile examination room waiting for test results, and the question came out of nowhere. "Are you happy, Erica? With your life, with your work, with the choices you've made?" I thought about it carefully before answering. "Yes, Dad, I am. I know it's not the life you wanted for me, but it's the life I chose, and it feels right." He nodded slowly, his fingers drumming against the examination table. "I've been thinking about those layoffs, the ones we did a few years ago. Do you ever wonder what happened to those people?" "Sometimes. I hope they found other jobs, better jobs." I looked some of them up. David Chen, the machine operator, he was unemployed for 8 months after we let him go. Lost his house. His family had to move in with relatives. I didn't know what to say. This was the first time my father had ever expressed any regret about business decisions that affected employees. "Maybe you were right," he continued. "Maybe there were other ways to handle that situation. Maybe I was too focused on the numbers and not focused enough on the people behind them." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was an acknowledgement. An admission that the corporate world's priorities might not always align with basic human decency. It was as close as my father would ever come to admitting that my work at the shelter had value. The treatments continued for 18 months. Chemotherapy, radiation, experimental drugs that made him sick and weak but gave us hope that we might have more time together. During this period, he began showing more interest in Hope Haven, asking detailed questions about our programs and the challenges we faced. He even made a modest donation, though he insisted on doing it anonymously. He died on a Tuesday morning in late December, peacefully in his sleep after a particularly difficult round of treatments. Sarah and I were both at the hospital, having spent the night in his room. We held his hands as his breathing grew shallow and then stopped altogether. For a few minutes, we were just two daughters who had lost their father. Grief overwhelming the years of conflict and competition between us. But the truce didn't last long. Within hours of his death, Sarah was already thinking about the business, about the will, about the distribution of assets. She had always assumed that she would inherit everything, that my work at the shelter had effectively removed me from consideration as a serious heir. The idea that our father might have left me anything significant, was inconceivable to her. The funeral was held at Fourth Presbyterian Church on Michigan Avenue, a venue that reflected our father's status in the Chicago business community. Hundreds of people attended, from company executives to political figures to clients and competitors. They spoke about his vision, his leadership, his contributions to the local economy. They described him as a giant of industry, a man who had built something lasting and valuable. I listened to the eulogies and wondered if any of these speakers had ever met David Chen or Janet Morrison or Rebecca Torres. I wondered if they understood that my father's legacy was more complicated than quarterly profit reports and stock valuations. He had been a loving father and a successful businessman, but he had also been someone who viewed people as resources to be managed, rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect. During the reception after the funeral, several of his business associates approached me with condolences that felt perfunctory and hollow. They asked polite questions about my work, clearly having no idea what I actually did or why I had chosen to do it. To them, I was Robert Patterson's younger daughter, the one who had disappointed him by rejecting the corporate world for social work. One man, a banking executive who had known my father for decades, summed up their collective bewilderment perfectly. "Your father always said you had a good heart, Erica. I'm sure you'll put that to good use now that you'll be taking a more active role in the family business." He assumed, as they all did, that my father's death would mark the end of my social work phase and the beginning of my return to respectability. They couldn't imagine that someone would choose to help homeless people when they could choose to manage a manufacturing empire instead. I smiled politely and didn't bother to correct him. Let them think what they wanted to think. In a few days, Marcus would read the will, and everyone would discover that my father's final decisions had been more complicated than they anticipated. The week between the funeral and the will reading gave me time to reflect on my relationship with my father and the path that had led me to Hope Haven. I had never intended to disappoint him or to reject his values. I had simply followed my conscience to work that felt meaningful and important. But I had learned something valuable during those 3 years at the shelter. I had learned that there were different ways to measure success, different definitions of a life well lived. Corporate profits were one metric, but they weren't the only one. Helping people rebuild their lives after devastating setbacks, providing dignity and respect to society's most vulnerable members, creating communities of support for those who had been abandoned by family and institutions. These accomplishments might not generate quarterly reports, but they generated something more valuable: hope. Standing in Marcus's office, watching Sarah burn what she thought was my inheritance, I realized that my father had understood this better than I had given him credit for. The conditions he had placed on my inheritance were frustrating and paternalistic, but the inheritance itself was an acknowledgement that my work had value. He was giving me the resources to do that work on a much larger scale, to help thousands of people instead of dozens. The money came with strings attached, but the strings didn't change the fundamental recognition that my life's work was worthy of support. After 3 years of feeling like a disappointment, of enduring lectures about practical considerations and responsible career choices, my father had finally validated the path I had chosen. Sarah would contest the will, of course. She would hire expensive lawyers and drag the process through probate court for as long as possible. She would argue that our father wasn't competent when he made his final decisions, that he was influenced by medications or emotional manipulation. But I had something she didn't have: the knowledge that my inheritance wasn't just about money. It was about continuing work that mattered, about using resources to help people who had been written off by society, about proving that compassion and profit didn't have to be mutually exclusive. The war with Sarah was just beginning, but I wasn't the same naive idealist who had walked away from Patterson Manufacturing 3 years earlier. I had learned how to navigate complex bureaucracies, how to advocate for people who couldn't advocate for themselves, how to find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. Those skills would serve me well in the battles ahead. Sarah had resources and connections, but I had something more powerful: the absolute certainty that I was fighting for something bigger than myself. The $45 million wasn't just my inheritance. It was an opportunity to transform the lives of thousands of people who needed help, hope, and a second chance. I was ready for the fight. 6 weeks after the will reading, Sarah's legal assault began in earnest. The papers were served to me at Hope Haven on a Thursday morning while I was helping Maria coordinate the weekly supply delivery. A process server in an expensive suit looked completely out of place among the volunteers sorting donated clothing and canned goods, but he found me anyway, pressing the thick manila envelope into my hands with professional indifference. The lawsuit was even more comprehensive than I had anticipated. Sarah wasn't just contesting the will. She was attempting to have me declared mentally incompetent to receive the inheritance. Her legal team had crafted an elaborate narrative portraying me as someone who had been manipulated by radical social justice activists, someone whose judgment had been compromised by years of exposure to what they called extremist poverty advocacy groups. According to the filing, my work at Hope Haven was evidence of psychological instability. The documents suggested that I had developed what they termed savior complex disorder, a condition that supposedly made me unable to make rational financial decisions. They had even found a psychiatrist willing to testify that my rejection of corporate success in favor of social work indicated underlying mental health issues that made me unfit to manage a large inheritance. It was brilliant and disgusting in equal measure. Sarah had found a way to weaponize my compassion, to turn my dedication to helping others into evidence of mental illness. The legal language was carefully crafted to make my life's work sound like the delusions of someone who had lost touch with reality. Maria found me sitting in her office an hour later, still staring at the papers. "Bad news?" she asked gently. I handed her the lawsuit and watched her expression change as she read through the allegations. "They're claiming that working here proves you're mentally ill? Apparently caring about homeless people is a psychiatric condition now. This is insane, Erica. You're one of the most rational, thoughtful people I know. You've never made an impulsive decision in your life." But as the weeks passed, I began to understand the strategic brilliance of Sarah's approach. She wasn't just trying to take my inheritance. She was trying to destroy my credibility entirely. If she could convince a judge that I was mentally unstable, it wouldn't matter what evidence I had of her behavior. The recordings from our confrontations would be dismissed as the delusions of someone who couldn't be trusted to accurately perceive reality. The legal bills began accumulating immediately. I had hired Patricia Wong, a state attorney who came highly recommended, but her fees were consuming my modest savings at an alarming rate. Meanwhile, Sarah had enlisted the services of Morrison, Klein & Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms. They had assigned a team of 6 attorneys to the case, along with investigators, psychiatric experts, and forensic accountants. The disparity in resources was overwhelming. While I was trying to balance my work at Hope Haven with depositions and document reviews, Sarah's team was conducting a full-scale investigation into every aspect of my life. They interviewed former colleagues from Patterson Manufacturing, trying to find evidence that I had displayed erratic behavior during my brief corporate career. They spoke with neighbors, former professors, even people I had dated years earlier. What disturbed me most was how many people seemed willing to cooperate with their investigation. Former coworkers who had barely spoken to me during my time at the company suddenly had vivid memories of concerning behavior. They described me as withdrawn, obsessive about social causes, unable to focus on practical business matters. None of it was technically false, but the way they presented it made my principled stands sound like signs of instability. 3 months into the legal battle, Sarah's team made their most devastating move yet. They subpoenaed Hope Haven's financial records, claiming that my access to the shelter's operations gave me inappropriate influence over vulnerable populations. They suggested that I had been using my position to recruit supporters for my legal case, manipulating homeless clients into providing character references in exchange for preferential treatment. The investigation shut down several of our programs, while auditors combed through every transaction, every client interaction, every decision I had been involved in over the past 3 years. Clients who depended on our services were turned away because staff members were too busy responding to legal demands to provide normal operations. Maria was furious, but she was also scared. Hope Haven operated on thin margins with constant oversight from multiple government agencies. The last thing we needed was a prolonged investigation that could jeopardize our funding and reputation. One evening, as we watched investigators carry boxes of files out of the building, she pulled me aside for a difficult conversation. Erica, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. I knew what was coming, but I let her say it anyway. Is there any possibility that you could resolve this legal situation by accepting whatever settlement Sarah is offering? I know it's not fair, but we can't afford to have this investigation continue indefinitely. It was a reasonable question from someone who had dedicated her life to helping others and was now watching that work be undermined by my family drama. But it also felt like a betrayal, like one more person questioning whether my principles were worth the collateral damage they were causing. She's not offering a settlement, Maria. She wants everything: the inheritance, my reputation, my credibility. If I give in now, it won't just affect me. It will send a message that people like Sarah can destroy anyone who threatens their interests. I understand that, but we have clients who need services. Real people with real problems who can't wait for your legal battle to be resolved. She was right, of course. While I was fighting for abstract principles, vulnerable people were suffering concrete consequences. The heating system in the women's dormitory was still broken, and we couldn't afford repairs while the investigation was ongoing. 2 families had been turned away the previous week because we couldn't process new admissions while staff members were busy responding to subpoenas. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at Sarah's latest legal filing, a motion requesting that the court freeze all assets related to the estate until my mental competency could be properly evaluated. If the motion succeeded, I wouldn't just lose access to the inheritance. I would lose access to my modest trust fund allowance as well. I would be unable to pay my rent, my legal fees, or even basic living expenses. The strategic elegance of Sarah's plan was becoming clear. She didn't need to prove that I was mentally ill. She just needed to create enough doubt and chaos to make continuing the fight impossible. Even if I eventually won the legal battle, the victory would be meaningless if I had been destroyed financially and professionally in the process. I was contemplating the possibility of surrender when my phone rang at 11:30 that night. The caller ID showed Diana's number, which surprised me. My cousin had been supportive but cautious throughout the legal proceedings. Clearly uncomfortable with the family conflict but unwilling to take sides publicly. Erica, I'm sorry to call so late, but I just heard something I thought you should know about immediately. Her voice was tense, excited, and slightly out of breath, as if she had been hurrying. What is it? I was at a charity gala tonight, one of those boring fundraisers for the art museum. Sarah was there, with Thomas, working the room like she always does. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I overheard her talking to someone about your case. I waited, sensing that Diana was building up to something significant. She was talking to Jonathan Morrison, the senior partner at her law firm. They thought they were being discreet, but the music had stopped and their voices carried. Erica, she admitted that the whole mental incompetency angle is fabricated. She said, and I quote, "Obviously Erica isn't actually crazy, but the appearance of instability is enough to tie this up in court for years." My heart started racing. Did anyone else hear this? That's the thing. I was standing near Margaret Clearwater, you know, the Tribune Society reporter. She was taking notes for her column, and I saw her write something down right after Sarah made that comment. Margaret Clearwater was notorious for her gossipy society coverage, but she was also a legitimate journalist with a reputation for accuracy. If she had overheard Sarah admitting to fraudulent legal tactics, it could change everything. Diana, this is incredibly important. Would you be willing to provide a sworn statement about what you heard? I was hoping you would ask. I'm already drafting something for your attorney. I can't stand watching Sarah destroy you with lies when I know the truth. The next morning, I called Patricia Wong with the news about Diana's testimony. She was immediately interested, but she also warned me about the challenges of using hearsay evidence in court. Even with Diana's testimony, we would need corroborating evidence to prove that Sarah's legal strategy was based on deliberately false claims. What we really need, Patricia explained, is some way to demonstrate a pattern of deceptive behavior. Something that shows this isn't just aggressive litigation, but actual fraud. I thought about the recordings I had made of my conversations with Sarah, but those wouldn't be enough. She had been careful not to admit outright that her legal claims were false. What we needed was evidence of her coordinating the fraudulent psychiatric testimony or manipulating witnesses to provide false statements. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jennifer, Marcus Whitman's assistant, called me 3 days after Diana's revelation. She sounded nervous and kept looking over her shoulder, as if she was afraid of being overheard. "Miss Patterson, I know I shouldn't be calling you directly, but I found something I think you need to see. Could we meet somewhere private?" We arranged to meet at a coffee shop far from the Loop, in a neighborhood where neither of us was likely to encounter anyone we knew. Jennifer arrived looking pale and anxious, clutching a manila folder against her chest like a shield. "I want you to know that I'm only doing this because what's happening isn't right," she said without preamble. "I've worked for Mr. Whitman for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like what your sister is trying to do." She opened the folder and pulled out photocopies of several documents. The first was a check made out to Dr. Richard Steinberg, the psychiatrist who had provided the expert testimony supporting Sarah's mental incompetency claims. The check was for $50,000, drawn on Sarah's personal account and dated 2 weeks before drive. Steinberg's initial evaluation. "She paid him before he even met with you," Jennifer explained. "The whole psychiatric evaluation was bought and paid for." The second document was even more damaging. It was an email exchange between Sarah and Jonathan Morrison, discussing strategies for managing witness testimony and, quote, ensuring consistent messaging about the defendant's mental state. The emails contained detailed instructions for coaching potential witnesses on what to say about my behavior, along with suggested talking points that would support the mental incompetency narrative. "How did you get these?" I asked. "Mr. Whitman has been handling your father's estate for 20 years. He knew your father well, respected him enormously. When he saw what Sarah was doing, he asked me to keep copies of everything that came through our office related to the will contest. He said he had a feeling the truth would eventually matter." I stared at the documents, hardly believing what I was seeing. This wasn't just aggressive litigation. It was a coordinated fraud designed to steal my inheritance through perjured testimony and manufactured evidence. "Jennifer, you realize that providing these documents could cost you your job?" She nodded. "I know. But I also know that your father was a good man who made specific decisions about how his money should be distributed. Sarah doesn't get to override those decisions just because she doesn't like them." Patricia Wong's reaction to the documents was immediate and decisive. "This changes everything. We're not just defending against a will contest anymore. We're exposing criminal conspiracy. I need to file an emergency motion with the court immediately." The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. Over the weekend, Patricia and I prepared our case, organizing the evidence into a clear narrative of fraud and conspiracy. We had Diana's testimony about Sarah's admission that the mental incompetency claims were fabricated. We had the financial records showing payment to Dr. Steinberg before his evaluation. We had the email evidence of witness coaching and coordinated deception. Most importantly, we had the recordings of my conversations with Sarah, which now took on new significance in light of the other evidence. Her threats and manipulations weren't just family drama. They were part of a deliberate pattern of illegal behavior designed to steal my inheritance. Sarah arrived at the courthouse on Monday morning with her full legal team, clearly expecting another routine procedural hearing. She was dressed immaculately, as always, projecting the confident authority of someone who had never lost a fight that mattered to her. Thomas walked beside her, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the aggressive legal tactics his wife had been employing. The courtroom was small but formal, with dark wood paneling and tall windows that let in streams of morning sunlight. Judge Catherine Martinez presided, a woman in her 50s with a reputation for fairness and impatience with legal misconduct. She had been reviewing our emergency motion since Friday and had clearly spent considerable time studying the evidence. Patricia stood to present our case, her voice clear and confident as she outlined the pattern of fraud and conspiracy that Sarah's team had orchestrated. She presented each piece of evidence methodically, building a comprehensive picture of deliberate deception, designed to subvert the legal process. When she played the recording of Diana's testimony about Sarah's admission, I watched my sister's face drain of color. When Patricia presented the check to Dr. Steinberg, Sarah's lead attorney began whispering frantically in her ear. When the email evidence was introduced, showing the coordinated effort to manufacture false testimony, Sarah looked like she might be sick. Judge Martinez asked few questions during Patricia's presentation, but her expression grew increasingly stern as the evidence accumulated. When Patricia finished, the judge turned to Sarah's legal team for their response. Jonathan Morrison stood slowly, clearly unprepared for the devastating evidence that had just been presented. He attempted to argue that the documents were taken out of context, that the payment to Dr. Steinberg was a standard consultation fee, that the witness coordination was simply normal litigation strategy. But his arguments sounded hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence. Judge Martinez interrupted him several times, asking pointed questions about the timing of payments, the content of emails, and the ethics of the tactics his firm had employed. Finally, she had heard enough. "Mr. Morrison, I've reviewed this evidence carefully, and I find it deeply troubling. What we have here appears to be a coordinated effort to defraud the court through perjured testimony and manufactured evidence. I'm not just going to deny your client's motion. I'm going to refer this matter to the state attorney's office for criminal investigation." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Sarah stared at the judge in shock, as if she couldn't believe that her carefully crafted legal strategy was collapsing around her. Thomas put his hand on her arm, but she shook him off, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. Judge Martinez continued. "Furthermore, I'm dismissing the will contest in its entirety. The evidence clearly shows that the challenge was based on fraudulent claims and perjured testimony. Miss Patterson's inheritance will be released immediately, and all restrictions related to this legal proceeding are hereby lifted." I felt dizzy with relief and disbelief. After months of legal warfare, brutal character assassination, and financial strain, it was over. The inheritance was mine, free and clear, with no restrictions beyond those originally specified in my father's will. But the victory came with a bitter taste. As court officers began discussing the criminal investigation that would follow, I realized that Sarah had destroyed herself in her attempt to destroy me. Her reputation, her marriage, possibly even her freedom were now at risk because she couldn't accept that our father had chosen to recognize the value of my work. As we left the courthouse, Sarah and I made eye contact for the first time since the hearing began. The hatred in her eyes was pure and undiluted, but it was mixed with something else, the dawning realization that she had lost everything in her attempt to take what was never hers to begin with. Thomas caught up with me in the hallway outside the courtroom. He looked exhausted and defeated, aged years in the space of a few hours. "Erica, I want you to know that I never supported what Sarah was doing. I tried to talk her out of this lawsuit from the beginning, but she wouldn't listen. She was so convinced that you didn't deserve the money, so certain that she could find a way to take it from you." "I know, Thomas. I'm sorry you got caught up in this." He nodded sadly. "I think our marriage might be over. I can't stay with someone who would do what she did to her own sister. The fraud, the lying, the willingness to destroy innocent people to get what she wanted. I don't know who she is anymore." As I walked away from the courthouse, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years ago, I had walked away from corporate success to help homeless people, disappointing my father and earning my sister's contempt. Today, I was walking away with $45 million and the vindication that my life's work had value. The money would transform Hope Haven's ability to serve clients, but it would also transform my relationship with Sarah forever. She had revealed herself completely, showing that there were no limits to what she would do to get what she wanted. The sister I had grown up with, competed with, and occasionally loved despite everything, was gone, replaced by someone capable of fraud, perjury, and deliberate cruelty. But as I thought about the clients waiting at Hope Haven, about the programs we could expand and the lives we could change, I realized that Sarah's destruction was her own choice. I had simply refused to be destroyed along with her. 1 year later, I stood in the newly renovated lobby of Hope Haven, watching families move into our expanded transitional housing units. The space that had once been a cramped warehouse now featured separate family suites, a children's learning center, and a commercial kitchen capable of serving 500 meals daily. The $45 million had transformed not just the physical building, but our entire approach to helping people rebuild their lives. The money had come with unexpected complications that my father's marriage requirement couldn't have anticipated. Once the inheritance was released, I discovered that receiving such a large sum triggered a maze of tax implications, investment decisions, and legal obligations. I had to hire financial advisors, tax attorneys, and investment managers. The irony wasn't lost on me that managing wealth required the same kind of business acumen my father had always wanted me to develop, just applied to different purposes. But the most profound change wasn't financial. It was watching how people treated me differently once word spread about the inheritance. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be my friend. Social invitations poured in from Chicago's philanthropic community. Board positions at prestigious nonprofits were offered to me with barely concealed eagerness. Men who had never noticed me before began asking for dates with transparent motivations. I learned to navigate this new landscape carefully, using my father's money strategically while staying true to the values that had brought me to this point. We established the Patterson Foundation for Housing Security, focusing on innovative approaches to ending homelessness rather than just managing it. We funded research into affordable housing models, supported policy advocacy for tenant rights, and created scholarship programs for people transitioning out of homelessness. Sarah's criminal trial had been a media sensation in Chicago's business community. The fraud charges resulted in a plea bargain that included 2 years of probation, substantial fines, and community service requirements. More devastating than the legal consequences was the complete destruction of her reputation. She lost her position at Patterson Manufacturing. Her marriage to Thomas ended in divorce, and her social circle abandoned her entirely. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall. If anything, watching my sister's self-destruction reinforced my belief that money and power without moral grounding inevitably led to corruption. She had everything our father valued: success, wealth, social status, but it hadn't been enough. Her desperate need for more had ultimately cost her everything she already possessed. The marriage requirement from my father's will remained technically in effect, though it no longer seemed relevant. I had access to the full inheritance for charitable purposes, and my personal needs were modest. Sometimes I wondered if my father had anticipated this outcome, if he had structured the will knowing that I would find ways to use the money effectively regardless of my marital status. Marcus Whitman retired 6 months after the trial, finally able to step away from the legal practice that had consumed most of his adult life. During our final meeting to close out the estate paperwork, he shared something that my father had told him shortly before his death. "Your father said that he was proud of both his daughters, but for different reasons. He was proud of Sarah's ambition and business sense, but he was proud of your character and compassion. He believed that character would ultimately prove more valuable than ambition." Those words meant more to me than the inheritance itself. For most of my adult life, I had felt like a disappointment to my father, someone who had rejected his values and chosen a path he couldn't understand. Learning that he had recognized the worth of my choices, even if he hadn't always supported them, provided a closure I hadn't realized I needed. Diana and I had grown closer during the legal battle, bonding over our shared experience of family dysfunction and our commitment to honoring our father's memory in positive ways. She moved back to Chicago and joined the Patterson Foundation board, bringing her marketing expertise to our efforts to change public perceptions about homelessness and poverty. Thomas found his way to my office about 8 months after his divorce was finalized. He looked healthier than I had seen him in years, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He wanted to apologize for not speaking up sooner about Sarah's behavior, for enabling her destructive choices through his silence. "I convinced myself that I was being a supportive husband," he said. "But really, I was just avoiding conflict. If I had challenged her earlier, maybe things wouldn't have gone so far." I appreciated his honesty, but I also understood that changing Sarah would have required her own recognition that change was necessary. She had been committed to a worldview that divided people into winners and losers, where compassion was weakness, and any success that didn't come at someone else's expense wasn't worth celebrating. The true measure of the inheritance's impact became clear during our first annual report. Hope Haven had helped 347 families transition into permanent housing, a 400% increase from our pre-inheritance numbers. Our job training programs had achieved an 85% placement rate. Most importantly, we had demonstrated that homelessness wasn't an intractable problem, but a solvable challenge that required adequate resources and evidence-based approaches. These results attracted attention from policymakers and social service agencies across the country. I found myself testifying before congressional committees, consulting with mayors on housing policy, and speaking at conferences about innovative approaches to ending homelessness. It was surreal to remember that just 2 years earlier, Sarah had dismissed my work as meaningless charity that accomplished nothing. The business skills I had learned during my brief time at Patterson Manufacturing proved unexpectedly valuable in this new role. Managing a large foundation required the same strategic thinking, financial analysis, and stakeholder management that my father had always insisted were essential for success. The difference was that success was measured in lives changed rather than profits generated. On quiet evenings in my apartment, I sometimes thought about the fake check that Sarah had burned in Marcus's office. That dramatic moment had seemed like the climax of our conflict, but it had really been just the beginning. The real battle hadn't been fought in conference rooms or courtrooms, but in the fundamental question of what constituted a meaningful life. Sarah had defined success through accumulation and domination, believing that worth was measured by how much you could take and keep. I had chosen a different definition, one that measured worth by how much you could give and how many lives you could improve. Our father's inheritance had ultimately validated both approaches, giving Sarah the business empire she craved, and giving me the resources to pursue the work I valued. But only one of those approaches had proven sustainable. Sarah's relentless pursuit of more had led to fraud, family destruction, and personal ruin. My focus on helping others had led to professional fulfillment, community impact, and financial security that exceeded anything I had dared to imagine. The lesson wasn't that money was evil or that business success was inherently corrupting. The lesson was that how you pursue success and what you do with it once you achieve it reveals who you really are. My father had built his fortune through legitimate business practices and had used his final act to ensure that fortune would continue creating value after his death. Sarah had tried to steal what wasn't hers and had destroyed herself in the process. As I locked up my office at Hope Haven and walked home through the Chicago streets, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. 3 years ago, I had been the disappointing daughter who threw away corporate opportunities to work with homeless people. Today, I was running one of the most innovative housing nonprofits in the country, funded by an inheritance that had come to me because my father ultimately understood that helping others was the highest form of success. The money in my bank account was just a number, impressive but not personally meaningful. What mattered was what that money could accomplish, how many families it could house, how many children it could feed, how many people it could help reclaim their dignity and hope. Sarah had burned a fake check because she couldn't bear the thought of me having something she wanted. But what she had really tried to destroy wasn't money or paper or even my inheritance. She had tried to destroy the idea that kindness and compassion could be rewarded, that helping others was a legitimate form of success. She had failed completely. And in her failure, she had proven that my father's final judgment had been absolutely correct. Character really was more valuable than ambition, and the fake check she had burned had been nothing compared to the real values that couldn't be destroyed by flame, fraud, or family betrayal. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.